Speaker, can I say it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Fareham in what is his last speech to this House. Like Madam Deputy Speaker, I also faced him through the long hours of many long finance bills when he was on the shadow front bench for the Treasury team, and he gave us a reflective and loyal speech this afternoon, which has been characteristic, I think, of the way that he served his party and the way he served his government. And I think it's a shame that he's not on the front bench and is on the back bench this afternoon, because perhaps then he wouldn't be leaving this House at the dissolution of this Parliament. But he has a problem, because as the Leader of the Opposition, my right honourable friend, said, this is a budget that cannot be believed. Let me pick just two things that the Chancellor said during his budget statement this afternoon. Living standards, he said, are higher than when we came into office. Today, he said, our economy is fundamentally stronger than it was 5 years ago. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the gap has never been greater between their rhetoric and the reality of everyday people's lives. And I want to pursue two arguments that expose some of the rhetoric we heard from the Chancellor and some of the reasons why their long-term economic plan is failing, and the weakness, the structural and cyclical weakness of our economy remains 5 years after they came into office. And there are two principal arguments, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first is that this government's economic policy directly choked off the recovery that was underway at the last election in May 2010. And that led to the slowest economic recovery from recession that we've seen in this country for 100 years. And the second is this, that the economic recovery that we have seen is unbalanced, unequal and unsustainable. The structural weaknesses are still there, despite the rhetoric that we heard from the Chancellor, the rabbits that came out of the hat. The underlying failures of the long-term economic plan are unchanged by this budget. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm listening carefully to what the honourable gentleman has been saying, as well as many members opposite, but would he at least acknowledge that running a deficit of over 10% was unsustainable, and that may have well fueled some growth in the short term, but in the long run, having a deficit running in excess of 10% is not sustainable, and something had to be done about that.
Members opposite, as the honourable gentleman says, but he will remember that after 10 years of the last Labour government, before the global financial crisis and recession hit, borrowing was lower than we came into office, debt was lower, and we have the deficit, and we have to deal with the deficit because of the way that the government at the time intervened to pull the country through that deep recession, to keep people in their own homes, to keep people in jobs, to keep firms in business. Of course there's a deficit, of course it needs to be dealt with. The difference between the parties, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we will deal with it in a more balanced way. There is a choice. You can do it with tax rises that are fair. You can do it with spending cuts, and you can also do it with efficiencies as well. And we will do what we need to do in a more balanced way. Of course, I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. But wasn't it the case that the most significant big change that occurred after 2008 was the plan which Labour backed, and which the coalition continued with for the first 2 years, of taking the RBS balance sheet down from 2.2 trillion to 1.5 trillion? Wasn't that the thing that provided the mighty shock to the British economy? It was something Labour wanted to do.
The intervention into the collapsed, failing banking system was a necessary step that our last Labour government took with support from others. Exactly. And most of the way that the RBS and the other bank intervention has been accounted for is actually dealt with differently in the national accounts, and I would have thought that the right honourable gentleman would have realised that. I'm going to wait to honourable friend, and then I'm going to make way because I'm conscious of what the Deputy Speaker said earlier on.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way? Has he seen the damning report from the National Audit Office on infrastructure spending, where it shows very clearly the massive cutbacks in roads, in education and housing that took place. So much for the long-term economic plan, which is driven by short-term considerations.
My honourable friend characteristically anticipates one of the points that I was going to make, but he will know, because he will have seen the papers that have been published alongside the budget, that they confirm that over this Parliament, the public sector capital investment has fallen by 44%. So his point is spot on. Now let me turn to some of the other facts, Madam Deputy Speaker, on growth. When the government took office, the economy was growing quarter on quarter at a 4% annualised rate. Now, the combination of policies introduced in the emergency budget the Chancellor told us about and reminded us about in 2010 meant that by the end of 2010, growth was zero, and that over the following years, 2011 to 14, the annual rate of growth was just 1.7%, and not the 2.4% that we were told we'd get when the Chancellor made his first budget statement. They choked off growth because of the policies and the cuts that they brought in. The slowest recovery from recession, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this country in 100 years. On public finances, let me remind the front bench opposite of that 2010 budget speech. The Chancellor claimed, and I quote, "Fear about the sustainability of sovereign debt is the greatest risk to the recovery." National debt then stood at 62% of GDP. The figures we've had today, Madam Speaker, confirm that it will be around 80% next year. Exactly. On the deficit, the Chancellor issued his binding formal mandate. In 2010, it said this: the books, he said, should be in balance in the final year of the 5-year forecast period, which is 2015-16. Now, the failure here is astonishing. Far from balance, the budget figures tell us that this will be in deficit by £75.3 billion. And the point of balance isn't next year, it's at least 3 years later than that. A comprehensive failure of long-term fiscal plans and long-term economic plans. So what's gone wrong? Well, look, the OBR says that those severe cuts and the significant VAT hike, let's not forget that, resulted in a loss to GDP of 2% in those first 2 years. Other estimates put the figure at least 3 to 5% over the Parliament. Second, the most productive spending in a downturn is capital spending. That's why organisations from the IMF, the OECD, to the OBR itself have all said that reducing investment spending has the most serious effect on negative economic growth. But that's exactly what the Chancellor did, as my right honourable friend, the member for Edmonton, has just said. Over the Parliament, public capital investment has almost halved. So when the Chancellor was faced with the choice to either spend money on, let's take an example, short-term income tax cuts for millionaires, or invest in the infrastructure this country needs for the long-term future, he chose the tax cuts for the millionaires. And this unprecedented squeeze that people have seen on wages has in part come from the cuts in services, the cuts in tax credits, the cuts in benefits, but it has also come because of the inherently weak demand we have for labour in this country. Now, before anyone jumps to their feet from the benches opposite and says, well, what about the headline unemployment rate? Yes, it's down, and that's good. But alongside that has meant that weak demand for labour has meant people can't get the hours, and they can't get the wages to be able to meet the bills that they're struggling to pay. And the weak growth has been reflected in real declining wages. The area that I represent, Madam Deputy Speaker, in South Yorkshire, has seen the average full-time worker take home now over £2,500 less than in 2010. Back in 2010, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor said he had a long-term economic plan. He said at that budget statement, I quote, "Our policy is to raise from the ruins of an economy built on debt a new, balanced economy where we save, invest and export." Well, the Treasury Minister says here. Well, let me tell her, household debt's increased over this Parliament and is set to rocket over the next 5 years. Ministers have halved public investment over this Parliament, despite a pledge to protect it. And on exports, Madam Deputy Speaker, the balance of trade, the balance of payments gap at the end of 2014 stood at 6% of GDP. That is the biggest since records began in 1955. And at the same time, our country is one that has grown further apart. After 10 years with Labour's regional development agencies in England, when the poorer English regions were able to achieve almost the same rate of GVA growth as the richest regions, the gap has grown every year since 2010. And the income of the UK's richest region is now over 10 times that of the poorest. And I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, the real output per head has actually shrunk since 2010 in the northwest, in Yorkshire and in the east of England. And let me remind the front bench what the Chancellor tried to claim. He tried to claim the north had grown faster than the south. Well, he was talking about last year. If we talk about the Parliament, the north over his watch in the 5 years has grown by 6%. The south has grown by 10%. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a budget you can't believe. And finally, at the heart of this failure is the dogma of pursuing a small state. Less investment, despite the consequences for productivity and growth. Cuts to benefits and tax credits to fund millionaires' tax cuts, despite the consequences for living standards. No serious export strategy or industrial strategy, despite the consequences for our balance of payments, and no serious plan for balanced regional growth, despite the consequences for the inequalities in our country. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a budget that is a warning to people about what's to come in the next Parliament. Because if the party opposite is re-elected on the 7th of May, this budget tells us that we will have a continuation, an economy and a country for the few, from a government of the few. Yeah.